The silence inside a royal palace is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of something buried alive, of corridors that remember every whisper, of curtains thin enough to let a secret through, of women who stood so close to power that power forgot they were there, and that forgetting became the most expensive mistake any ruler ever made. They were not advisors, they were not generals, they held no formal title that history thought worth preserving, but they were present, in the rooms where heirs were decided, where alliances quietly collapsed, where kings showed their fear before they remembered to hide it. They saw everything, and the men who ruled empires spent centuries designing elaborate, elegant, and ruthless systems to make sure you would never hear a single word those women knew. To understand what rulers feared, you have to understand how power actually moved inside a palace. Not the version preserved in official portraits and ceremonial records, but the version that existed in practice, in the hours before dawn when decisions were made, in the back rooms where nothing was written down. The formal architecture of any royal court was designed to project permanence: grand halls, throne rooms built to dwarf the human body, staircases that forced a visitor to ascend toward power as though climbing toward something divine. Every inch of the visible court was choreography, a controlled performance of absolute authority. But the real architecture was invisible. It lived in proximity. Who was allowed near the monarch's bedchamber? Whose voice reached the ear before the official audience began? Whose hand passed the letter across the table, and whose eyes scanned it first? The true map of a palace was not drawn in stone, it was drawn in access, and women, by the very nature of their assigned roles, had access that generals and ministers did not. A queen's lady-in-waiting was not merely a companion, she was present for private conversations between rulers and their most trusted advisors. She heard the morning discussions before the formal posture was assembled. She saw the correspondence that arrived sealed and left resealed. She understood from body language and tonal shift when a diplomat's visit had gone wrong and when an alliance was quietly dissolving. A royal nurse carried more sensitive knowledge than most ambassadors. She understood bloodlines at their most vulnerable. She knew which children were healthy and which were fragile. She knew which heirs had been told their father's plans and which had been deliberately kept ignorant. She knew the difference between an official royal birth and a privately managed one. An attendant who had served a monarch for 30 years had witnessed more succession crises, more private grief, more unguarded moments of fear and indecision than almost any man formally employed in the court's political structure. She had watched kings become old. She had seen the tremor in the hand before it was hidden in ceremony. She knew which treaties were made under duress and which alliances were built on something close to nothing. This was not intelligence gathering in any strategic sense. It was simply the consequence of presence, and it terrified the men who held power, not because these women were spies, but because they were witnesses, unintentional, indelible, and in a world where a single overheard detail could shift the balance of a succession dispute, uncontrolled witnesses were among the most dangerous things a ruler could have inside his walls. The information these women carried was not abstract. It was specific, operational, and in many cases irreplaceable. Consider what circulated quietly through royal inner chambers during any given decade of political tension. The question of legitimate heirs, whether a child born in the 7th month of a queen's confinement was truly the king's, whether an earlier pregnancy had ended in silence, whether a child recorded as stillborn had been placed elsewhere. These were not rumors, they were witnessed events, and the women who attended royal births held the only uncorrupted version of what actually happened. Consider assassination plots, which rarely began with a weapon. They began with a conversation, a shared frustration between two men who believed themselves alone, a name whispered that should not have been spoken, a meeting arranged under a cover that fooled everyone except the woman who happened to be carrying a candle down the adjacent corridor. Courts were not sealed environments. They were porous, and the porousness ran directly through the women who kept them functioning.
Consider the financial architecture of empire, the deals made outside of formal ledgers, the bribes disguised as gifts, the promises made to foreign powers that could never appear in official correspondence. Someone carried those documents. Someone witnessed the handshakes. Someone knew which treasurer was being paid twice, and which minister had a private arrangement with an enemy kingdom's envoy.
A single whisper could destabilize a throne, not metaphorically, literally. In a world where legitimacy was everything and the machinery of documentation was still fragile, a credible woman's testimony about what she had seen or heard could unravel entire narratives that rulers had spent years constructing. The official story only held if no one contradicted it, and the people most capable of contradiction were often the ones standing quietly in the corners of rooms where history was made. Rulers understood this. The question was never whether to act. The question was how. Killing was rarely the answer, not because rulers were restrained by mercy, history does not support that conclusion, but because execution produced its own problems. A woman publicly executed had to be publicly accused. An accusation required evidence, or at least a performance of evidence. A trial, even a controlled one, created a space in which fragments of the real story might surface. Witnesses to the trial carried what they heard. A martyr, even an inconvenient one, attracted memory. People remembered the silenced. They wondered what the silenced had known. Far more effective was the management of silence before it could become dangerous. The first tool was surveillance. Correspondence monitored, letters opened before they were sealed again, read by trusted intermediaries, then delivered as though untouched. In courts across centuries and continents, the monitoring of women's written communication was standard practice, not discussed openly, not recorded in administrative logs as surveillance, but simply done. A woman who understood this either stopped writing or developed languages within languages, codes that appeared domestic and revealed nothing but carried meaning to the right recipient. Movement was the second mechanism of control, restricting where a woman could go, who she could speak with, which parts of the palace she could access. All of this could be accomplished without force. It required only ceremony. Reassignment to a different chamber, relocation to a wing further from the political center, a change of duties framed as an honor, a promotion, a gift, which happened to place the woman in a position where her knowledge became inaccessible rather than dangerous. The third was isolation, systematically removing a woman from her alliances, dismissing her companions one by one for unrelated reasons, replacing her closest confidants with women whose loyalty was to the ruler, not to her. This was patient work. It unfolded over months, sometimes years, but at the end of it, a woman who had once been embedded in a web of relationships and mutual trust found herself alone in the middle of a court where she could not identify a single person she was certain she could confide in.
And the fourth, perhaps the most corrosive, was the demand for visible loyalty. Public statements, ceremonial appearances at the side of the very person who was quietly dismantling her freedom. Required attendance at celebrations of the dynasty whose secrets she carried. This was not incidental, it was calculated, because a woman who appeared publicly aligned with a ruler could not easily become a credible voice against him. Her own presence at his ceremonies became evidence that could be used against her memory. She had been seen smiling, she had been seen bowing. Whatever she later said, or whatever others later said on her behalf, the image of her compliance would persist in records and in minds. This was containment without chains, and it was devastatingly effective. When surveillance and isolation were not enough, there was the architecture of confinement, which in the vocabulary of power almost never used that word. A woman removed to a distant estate was not imprisoned, she was given rest, country air, relief from the pressures of court life. The language was always benevolent. The reality was that she was now 60 miles from the capital, attended by servants who reported her movements, surrounded by people whose loyalty had been quietly confirmed before her arrival. She could walk in gardens, she could receive visitors, the visitors who had been deemed acceptable. She could not return to court without permission. That was never formally denied, simply never granted.
Convents served this purpose with remarkable frequency across European, Byzantine, and Orthodox Christian courts. A woman sent into religious life was publicly honored, chosen for holiness, elevated to a sphere closer to God. Privately, she was neutralized. Inside convent walls, her ability to communicate was limited by rule and by practice. Her political relationships slowly atrophied. The world that had known her gradually reorganized itself around her absence, and the institution that held her had every incentive to cooperate with the secular power that had placed her there, because those arrangements ran in both directions. Palace house arrest required even less explanation. A woman whose health required rest, a woman in mourning, a woman whose grief made public appearances inappropriate at this time. These justifications required no documentation. They produced no records that could later be examined. The woman simply became less visible, and then invisible, and then a name in a list that later chroniclers would pass over because there was so little attached to it. The word that recurs across cultures and centuries is protection. She was being protected.
From the instabilities of court life, from the pressures of political proximity, from enemies who wished her harm, the framing was always paternalistic and always generous, and it meant in practice that the very thing being used against her was being presented as something done for her. This was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which the entire system perpetuated itself. A woman could not easily resist protection. She could not formally object to care. She could not publicly refuse an honor without appearing unstable, ungrateful, or, most usefully for her keepers, suspicious. Marriage was perhaps the most elegant instrument in this repertoire, not because it was the most brutal, it was not in most cases, but because it accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously while leaving behind no evidence of intent. A woman who knew too much, transferred to a foreign court through a diplomatic marriage, was no longer accessible. She was no longer in the same political ecosystem. The information she carried became, over time, outdated. The alliances she knew of shifted. The people she could name died or changed their positions. The specific details that had made her knowledge dangerous slowly lost their operational relevance. Distance did the work that execution would have done without the complications. A woman who was remarried within the same kingdom but to a loyal family was encased in a different kind of structure. Her new husband's interests were aligned with the ruler's interests. Her movements, her communications, her relationships, all of these were now filtered through a man whose continued standing depended on the ruler's favor. This was not surveillance from above. It was surveillance from beside, intimate, constant, unbreakable. And in some cases, the marriage itself was a message, a rewriting of identity performed in public. The woman who had been a queen's confidant became a provincial baron's wife. The woman who had attended the most sensitive diplomatic negotiations became someone's mother in a countryside household. The name changed, sometimes. The social position changed, always. The person who had stood at the center of events was repositioned to the margins. And the repositioning was publicly celebrated as fortunate, as elevation, as the natural resolution of a life in service. She had been placed in the world. Everyone was pleased for her. And the details she carried moved with her into a life from which they could not easily escape.
What happened to the records themselves followed a separate, parallel logic. The women could be removed. The documents required different handling. Chronicles were edited, not in the crude sense of burning volumes, though that happened too, but in the more sustainable sense of simply choosing not to include. A name omitted from a succession account, a role unmentioned in a ceremonial record, an episode in the official history that skipped cleanly from one event to another, leaving no visible seam where a person had been removed. The reader who did not know what was missing could not know to look for it. Portraits were destroyed or were never commissioned.
The visual record of a court depended on patronage. Painters painted whom they were paid to paint, and preserved whom they were permitted to preserve. A woman whose existence became inconvenient could be removed not only from narrative but from image. Future generations would search for her face and find nothing. The absence would be read as evidence that she had been unimportant. Letters were intercepted, confiscated, or simply never returned to their writers. The correspondence that might have formed the archive of a life, the testimony of what a woman had observed, understood, and carried, disappeared into collections that were either deliberately destroyed or became inaccessible under layers of institutional control. And official histories, once reshaped, had a way of becoming self-confirming. A later chronicler who found no evidence of a woman's role in a particular event was not lying when he wrote her out. He was working from sources that had already been curated. The erasure was clean precisely because it was not performed in a single violent act, but was accumulated patiently across documents, images, and institutional memory. Silence had become structural, institutional, self-perpetuating. The women were not only removed, they were made to have never fully been there. But confinement is not always the end of the story. Some women built influence from inside the architecture designed to contain them. Convents became centers of correspondence that moved along channels the secular court did not entirely control. Women in religious retirement who retained the loyalty of former attendants, who maintained connections to daughters, nieces, and allies who had not been removed from court, these women could still operate, slowly, carefully, through intermediaries whose movements attracted no scrutiny. A letter to a niece about household matters, a conversation between attendants during a permitted visit, the patient accumulation of small exchanges that together formed a network invisible to those monitoring individual threads. Women under palace confinement found that walls, paradoxically, could be a form of protection. Removed from the immediate political theater, they were also removed from its most immediate dangers. They could observe without being directly implicated. They could wait. The court that had silenced them was not static. It moved, it shifted, it accumulated its own crises and contradictions. And women who had survived long enough and who had maintained the disciplines of patience and restraint sometimes found that the wheel turned and that what had made them dangerous once made them valuable again. Not all of them, not most, but enough to suggest that the tools of confinement were imperfect and that the women subjected to them were not passive. They navigated. They preserved what they could. They communicated what they were able to communicate. And occasionally, from behind the walls built to silence them, they shaped events in ways that the official record, by design, could not fully capture.
The charges were almost always framed in gendered terms: immorality, improper relationships, sexual dishonesty. These accusations were chosen not arbitrarily, but precisely. They were unchallengeable in the cultural framework that governed public life. A woman accused of sexual misconduct could not effectively defend herself in most of the legal systems available to her, not because the accusation was necessarily believed, but because the very act of defending herself required her to occupy a position the culture had already made indefensible. She was either guilty or she was performing a kind of public assertion that would itself be read as evidence of bad character. The punishment was a warning. To the woman, obviously, but more sustainably to every woman who observed it, to every attendant who understood that her own proximity to power, her own incidental accumulation of knowledge, was a risk that had just been publicly quantified. The system did not need to silence every woman. It needed only to demonstrate, periodically and visibly, what silence was worth. The architecture of this silence was not unique to one culture or one century.
It ran through courts separated by oceans and generations, Byzantine empresses removed to convents whose names appear once in a chronicle and then vanish, Ottoman women confined to architectural structures designed explicitly to limit their movement and their speech, European queens whose correspondence networks were monitored from the moment of their marriages, Chinese imperial consorts whose fates, after the deaths of emperors, were managed with bureaucratic efficiency that left almost no trace of individual experience. The mechanisms varied in their specific forms. The underlying logic was consistent. Information destabilizes authority. A woman close to power is a woman close to information. Information requires management, and the most durable form of management is not elimination, which is costly and creates its own instabilities, but disappearance, the gradual, documented, institutional removal of a person from the spaces where her knowledge might become a problem. The legal systems that governed these societies were not neutral in this process, they were participants. Women who could not own property in their own names could not establish independent bases from which to resist relocation or remarriage. Women whose testimony was legally subordinated to men's testimony in formal proceedings could not easily use legal structures to contest confinement. Women who had been raised in cultural frameworks that defined obedience as virtue and speech as transgression had already internalized some portion of the silence that would later be enforced upon them. The system was not built specifically to target women who knew too much. It was built to manage women generally. The targeting of women who knew too much was simply one of its most consistent applications.
What survives of these women survives in fragments, a name in a list of convent inhabitants, a brief notation in a household account, a single letter that survived because it was misfiled or because the person who should have destroyed it did not, a genealogical record that preserves a marriage date but no other details, an absence in the official portrait that is just noticeable enough to someone looking carefully to suggest that someone was there. These fragments are not the full record. They are what remained after the full record was managed. There are women whose roles in major historical events we will not recover because the mechanisms that removed them from those events were thorough. There are testimonies that were never written down, or were written and destroyed, or were written and survive somewhere in an archive that has not been fully examined, or were translated and then retranslated until the original meaning dissolved. There is knowledge that was carried inside a human life that ended without transmission, taken to a convent, taken to a distant estate, taken quietly underground. The powerful rulers who managed these women understood something that is still true. To control a narrative, you do not need to destroy every dangerous voice. You need only to ensure that dangerous voices cannot find their audience. Separation, relocation, silence, institutional memory. These are the instruments through which a story becomes the only story. The women who knew different versions were not always eliminated. They were made unreachable, and unreachable over time became invisible, and invisible became forgotten, and forgotten became the version we inherited. Somewhere in the archives there are names we cannot find. Women who stood in the correct rooms at the correct moments and understood what they were witnessing. Women who held in the private chambers of their own memory the uncurated version of events that shaped dynasties and toppled alliances and determined which children sat on which thrones and which men were remembered as great. Those women moved carefully through corridors of power. They were watched, they were managed, they were removed, remarried, retired, and rewritten. And the records that survived them were written by the people who needed them silent. Empires have always been built on secrets. Some of the most consequential ones were carried by women that history was carefully taught to forget.